He says nothing. You wait, but his silence is not empty. It is full of noise you can't hear. His silence may be louder than any words. It holds his confusion, his fears, his unsorted emotions. And perhaps it holds the ghost of who he thought he had to be. Many women ask, if he craves me, why is he silent? The answer is not where you're looking. It's not always in the texts that didn't come, not in the promises left hanging, not even in the moments you shared. The truth is more subtle and far more human. A man can crave your presence and still be paralyzed by his own nervous system. He can be drawn to your light and yet terrified of what it will reveal in him. Desire does not mean readiness. Attraction does not mean grounding. Craving does not mean emotional maturity. We often misread silence as disinterest, but in many cases, silence is not an absence of emotion. It is the weight of unspoken emotion that has nowhere safe to land. So before you chase answers, pause, not to decode him, but to meet yourself. Because the deepest wisdom begins not with understanding him, but with understanding how you respond to silence itself. There is a strange and subtle contradiction that exists in the space between longing and silence. A man may deeply crave a woman's presence, may even feel magnetically drawn to her, yet still remain silent. This silence often confuses and wounds the feminine heart. She interprets it as rejection or emotional detachment. But what if that silence is not coming from a lack of desire, but from the body's own internal confusion? The human nervous system doesn't lie. Long before thoughts arise and long before words are formed, the body sends signals, electrical, chemical, energetic, and those signals dictate behavior. When a man craves a woman, his body may experience that craving not as calm longing, but as agitation, pressure, or even threat. In such a state, his desire may trigger the exact same biological response as danger. This is not a conscious choice. It is the result of unprocessed stress, past emotional experiences, and how his nervous system has learned to survive. Consider the story of Amir, a man in his late 30s. He met Laila at a friend's gathering, and from the first moment, he felt a pull, intense, undeniable. She radiated calm, presence, and a kind of beauty that didn't scream but whispered. They spent hours talking that night, laughing, sharing small childhood memories. He hadn't felt this alive in years. The next day, she texted him. He read it and froze. He didn't reply. Not that day, not even the next. It wasn't that he didn't want to. He replayed her voice in his head, the softness of her eyes, the way she held a pause before speaking. But inside his body, something tightened. A foggy discomfort took over. Days passed. Leila felt confused. Was she mistaken in how he looked at her? Was it just politeness masked as connection? But Amir wasn't playing games. He wasn't avoiding her out of indifference. His body had associated emotional intensity with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. His nervous system shut down to protect him from the potential pain of attachment. What looked like silence to her was actually a primitive survival strategy at play in him. This is not uncommon. Neuroscience reveals that the autonomic nervous system, comprising the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, governs much of our relational behavior, especially under emotional pressure. When someone experiences high emotional arousal, such as falling for someone, they might enter a sympathetic fight or flight state. But if neither fighting nor fleeing is viable, the body can slip into a parasympathetic freeze response, where disengagement and numbing become the body's way of coping. It is this very freeze that often manifests as silence. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Many men carry the imprint of past rejections, emotional neglect, or family systems that didn't encourage open expression. So, when a woman's presence awakens something deep, something intimate, warm, and sacred, his system gets overwhelmed. He may crave her profoundly, but his physiology treats that craving as a threat. That's when silence appears, not as absence, but as the body's confused way of staying safe. There's a deeper lesson here. It is unwise to interpret craving as clarity. The presence of desire does not equal the capacity for connection. Many women find themselves entangled in emotional loops because they mistake intense attraction for stability. But without emotional regulation, craving becomes a storm, not a sanctuary. Let's return to Amir. A month after that night, he finally reached out. Apologetic, tentative, uncertain. Lila had already stepped back, focused on herself, not in bitterness, but with self-respect. When they met again, she asked directly, "Why did you disappear?" He sighed and looked down. "I didn't know how to show up for someone like you," he said. "You were too peaceful. I didn't trust I could hold that without messing it up." His silence wasn't about her. It was about him. It always was. In moments like these, women are invited not into self-doubt but into wisdom. The man who disappears after intimacy is not always deceitful. Often, he is disoriented. Craving can be disorganizing if a person has not yet learned to regulate emotion, to stay with openness, or to feel safe in connection. This understanding does not justify mistreatment or excuse emotional absence, but it allows space for compassion without self-betrayal. This is why emotional self-mastery is not just an inner skill, but a relational necessity. When you become aware of the hidden layers beneath someone's silence, you no longer take it personally. Instead, you observe the space between craving and clarity as a reflection of their inner state, not your worth. You remain rooted, still, without spiraling into narratives that wound you unnecessarily. There is a quote that lingers in the background of such lessons: "Not everything that is felt must be followed." A man may feel attraction, but that does not mean he has the discipline to turn it into something nourishing. A woman may feel confused by silence, but that does not mean she must translate it into personal rejection. Understanding this helps you recognize that silence can be a shield built not with conscious deception, but with emotional fear. Often, men are not taught how to hold emotional weight. They are taught to perform strength, not inhabit vulnerability. When the craving for intimacy arises, it shakes the very foundation of what they were conditioned to avoid. Consider the physiology of emotional safety. The vagus nerve, responsible for regulating many unconscious functions in the body, is also tied to feelings of connection and communication. When someone feels emotionally safe, the ventral vagal system activates, promoting calm, social engagement, openness. But when the body detects threat, even emotional threat, this system shuts down. Silence is then not a choice. It is an instinct. What becomes clear through all of this is that healing does not occur through pressure or pursuit. It occurs through awareness, space, and stillness. When a man is silent but craving, what he needs is not fixing, but internal recalibration. And when a woman understands this, she can create space, not for him to return necessarily, but for her own energy to remain whole. This is not about waiting. It is about watching. Not about pausing your life, but about pausing your assumptions. There is a maturity that forms when you no longer demand others to meet you in the places they are afraid to go. You honor their silence, not because it's acceptable, but because you refuse to be defined by it. And yet, the silence does hurt. It raises doubts. It whispers lies to the heart in the middle of the night. If he wanted me, he'd be here. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I wasn't enough. But these voices are not truth. They are echoes of earlier wounds, childhood experiences of being left unseen, misunderstood. This is the deeper journey, not just understanding him, but healing the parts of you that are activated by his absence. A woman who learns to breathe through these moments, to not chase, to not collapse inward, but to center herself in her own energy, she becomes powerful beyond measure. Her silence becomes a mirror to his silence. Not out of revenge, but out of self-respect, she does not withhold communication to manipulate. She simply no longer offers herself to someone who cannot hold her. In the end, silence is not always the absence of craving. Sometimes it is the body's cry for safety. And until a man feels safe in his own emotional skin, he will struggle to step toward the very thing he longs for. And so, in these moments, ask not, why is he silent? But what does his silence say about where he is in his inner journey? You cannot force someone into readiness, but you can remain rooted in your own. When you do, your energy changes. You become a lighthouse, not a search party, and only those ready for the light will walk toward it. It is easy to mistake the heat of emotional craving for the warmth of emotional readiness. But these two states are not the same. One burns quickly and brightly, sometimes leaving ashes in its wake. The other grows quietly, patiently, like a fire that warms a home. In relationships, this distinction often marks the difference between fleeting attraction and lasting connection. A man may crave a woman deeply, and yet, if he is not emotionally ready, that craving will not lead him to build, only to pursue, and once pursuit overwhelms him, silence returns. What many women interpret as inconsistency is often the result of a man caught between wanting and fearing. This is why craving, on its own, is not a sign of emotional maturity. In fact, emotional craving often arises from the same places within us that feel incomplete, ungrounded, or unloved. When a man craves a woman, especially in the early stages of connection, that craving may be a reflection not of who she is, but of what she represents: peace, warmth, softness, understanding. He may be drawn to her energy, like a man in a storm searching for shelter. But if he has not cultivated emotional resilience within himself, he cannot hold that shelter. He enters it, and quickly his system begins to shake. He questions, he doubts. He may even self-sabotage. There was a man named Ravi who once told the story of his relationship with a woman named Sarah. She was stillness in human form. Soft-spoken, grounded, thoughtful. When she walked into a room, she brought a silence that felt alive. Ravi had been through relationships that were full of chaos and noise, and when he met Sarah, it was like tasting still water after years of drinking fire. He was overwhelmed with desire. He texted her constantly, made plans to see her, talked of the future. Sarah, being more rooted, moved slowly, watched carefully. She allowed connection, but did not rush it. Within weeks, Ravi began to retreat. He didn't understand it himself. His desire hadn't changed, but suddenly he felt unsure. The very peace that drew him in now made him feel exposed, as if his own emotional immaturity had nowhere to hide. This is a common experience. Emotional craving seeks relief. It is often reactive. It wants to be filled, answered, met. But emotional readiness is different. Readiness holds space. It does not rush toward intensity, nor does it collapse under its own desire. It listens. It pauses. It knows the difference between attraction and alignment. A man who is emotionally ready does not just crave a woman's presence. He creates space for her. He doesn't just want her light. He is prepared to protect it. The human psyche is wired to pursue comfort, but not always to maintain it. If a man has lived with emotional conflict or inner instability, the experience of peace can feel foreign. Craving, in such cases, becomes a form of escape from oneself. The woman becomes the symbol of freedom, of wholeness, of healing. But no human can fulfill that role sustainably. And when the illusion fades, as it must, disillusionment follows. Silence replaces affection, not because love died, but because illusion collapsed. And in the ruins of that collapse, readiness must either rise or the man must retreat. Understanding this changes how a woman responds to male inconsistency. Instead of internalizing it as rejection, she begins to witness it as a mirror of the man's inner state. A mirror that does not reflect her worth, but his preparedness. This shift frees her from the trap of self-doubt. She no longer chases explanations from someone who cannot even explain his own heart to himself. Instead, she cultivates discernment, an inner knowing that not every craving deserves her energy. This is where the principle of feminine stillness begins to hold its power. There is something in the energy of a woman who does not chase, who does not collapse into emotion, who simply remains open, steady, radiant. That stillness speaks louder than any demand. It draws, but it also reveals. It draws in those who seek peace, but it reveals those who are afraid of it. A man who is emotionally unprepared will often find stillness uncomfortable. It exposes his restlessness. It shows him where he lacks rhythm. It is like silence in a noisy room. It reveals the echoes. When a woman begins to embody her stillness, not as a performance, but as her natural state, she changes the way men interact with her. They either rise into her presence or retreat into their patterns. Stillness is not passivity. It is strength. It is presence without pressure. It is the ability to hold space without collapsing into fear or expectation. In the story of Lena, a woman in her late 40s, she had spent most of her earlier life in relationships where she felt she had to earn love, perform, prove, please. When she began her journey into self-mastery, everything changed. She stopped performing. She stopped explaining herself to men who had not earned the right to her depth. And in that space, her energy changed. She began attracting men who were either deeply drawn to her or completely intimidated by her. The difference was not in them. It was in what her stillness revealed. One man, a teacher she met through a meditation circle, was fascinated by her presence. "You don't try to be light," he said. "And somehow, that makes you unforgettable." That is the quiet power of stillness. It activates a kind of gravitational pull, but it is not manipulative. It is not strategic. It comes from alignment. When you no longer need attention, you begin to command respect. And this shift in energy often confuses men who are used to being chased. For those who are emotionally immature, it feels like rejection. For those who are emotionally mature, it feels like home. Physiologically, energy is not just metaphor. It is real. The electromagnetic field of the heart, according to studies in neurocardiology, extends several feet outside the body and affects both your own nervous system and those around you. When your heart is in coherence, meaning your emotional state is calm, balanced, centered, you affect others in subtle but profound ways. This is why people often feel peace or tension simply by being in the presence of another. Your energy field precedes your words. And for a woman who has cultivated stillness, this becomes her language. A man who approaches such a woman does not just hear her speak. He feels her. He senses the boundary in her silence, the confidence in her restraint, the invitation in her gaze. And in that moment, something inside him must decide, will he rise to meet her frequency or will he retreat into familiar chaos? Either way, her stillness remains, unshaken, unbothered, unmoved. This is where craving and readiness once again separate. A man may crave the energy of such a woman, but unless he is willing to elevate his own inner state, he cannot stay. And she, grounded in her own worth, does not beg him to. This is not coldness. It is clarity. It is knowing that true connection cannot be chased. It must be met. The woman who understands this becomes less reactive to the waves of emotion that others bring. She no longer interprets silence as punishment nor attention as validation. She becomes the center of her own circle. She holds space not as a tactic, but as a way of life. And in doing so, she begins to attract relationships that are not based on urgency, but on resonance. In such a space, a man who is emotionally ready feels invited, not threatened. He does not need her to fix his silence, because he has learned how to navigate his own inner world. He does not disappear when things get intimate, because intimacy no longer terrifies him. He does not crave her as an escape. He cherishes her as a mirror. This is the ultimate paradox. The more you become still, the more you move others. The less you speak, the more your presence communicates. The less you try to be chosen, the more you invite the right choice. And in that space, silence is no longer something to fear. It becomes a tool of discernment. It reveals the truth, not just about others, but about yourself. So when a man craves you and yet falls silent, do not rush to fill the void. Let your energy speak. Let your stillness teach. You do not need to become louder to be heard. You need only to remain aligned. Those who are meant to hear you will. Those who are not were never listening. There is a moment in nearly every human relationship where connection becomes difficult to understand. One person opens, the other closes. One reaches out, the other pulls away, and often the withdrawal comes without warning, explanation, or closure. The silent distance creates confusion. Many women ask, why did he stop responding? Or why is he afraid of something that felt so beautiful? The answer lies deeper than behavior. It lies in the invisible patterns shaped long before the relationship ever began. Patterns forged in childhood, sculpted by family dynamics, reinforced by early emotional experiences. These patterns live beneath the surface of every adult relationship, guiding reactions, fears, and desires, often without awareness. Attachment styles are not labels to be judged. They are maps. They trace the terrain of a person's emotional development, showing where safety was learned, where trust was broken, and where love became conditional. When a man shows craving but falls into silence, it is often because his internal map does not lead him toward closeness. It leads him toward survival. His behavior is not a betrayal of you. It is a reflection of what closeness meant to him when he was too young to explain what he needed. Imagine a young boy growing up in a home where affection was inconsistent. Sometimes his parents were warm and attentive. Other times they were distracted, critical, or absent. Love was there, but it arrived without rhythm. This boy learned that emotional connection was unpredictable. He began to associate intimacy with uncertainty and craving with anxiety. As he grew older, his body carried these emotional imprints. Now, as a man, when he meets a woman who feels deeply safe and loving, his nervous system doesn't interpret that safety as a sanctuary. It interprets it as the prelude to loss. Because in his emotional memory, closeness has always come with a cost. These early dynamics are often the foundation of what is known in psychology as avoidant or anxious attachment. But beneath these labels is something more human, a nervous system that has learned to protect itself. When a man craves a woman but cannot sustain emotional openness, it may be because his inner world has never known what to do with stable love. He craves intimacy, but once it becomes real, his body remembers the past. And the past says, closeness is not safe. This is why healing cannot come only through words. It must come through presence, through somatic awareness, through the gentle retraining of the nervous system. A man can read 1,000 books about love and still panic when a woman says, I see you. Because to be seen fully, without judgment, threatens to unravel the defenses he's built for years. And when those defenses collapse too quickly, the mind pulls away and the body retreats. The woman is left with silence. She wonders what she did wrong. But the silence was not about her. It was about the emotional imprint of a time when love felt dangerous. There is a quote often shared in quiet circles of healing. If you don't heal what hurt you, you'll bleed on those who didn't cut you. This bleeding often shows up not in anger or aggression, but in silence, inconsistency, and distance. And it is here that understanding becomes essential, not for excusing behavior, but for protecting your own heart from unnecessary confusion. Take the story of Maya and Joel. They met in a workshop on conscious communication. Maya, in her early 40s, had done years of inner work. She had unlearned the patterns of self-abandonment and had begun to feel safe in her own skin. Joel, charismatic and intelligent, seemed open, curious, even emotionally expressive. In the beginning, he initiated contact, praised her depth, and expressed sincere desire to get closer. But as their emotional intimacy deepened, Joel's behavior began to shift. He became inconsistent, cancelled plans without notice, and eventually stopped replying to her messages altogether. Maya, grounded in her own awareness, resisted the urge to blame herself. Instead, she sat with the discomfort. She didn't chase or demand answers. Instead, she watched her own reactions. She remembered that Joel had mentioned being raised in a home where emotions were not welcome, where silence and avoidance were survival tools. She saw the pattern not as personal rejection, but as an inherited emotional reflex. Still, she didn't wait. She continued living her life, honoring her clarity, while holding compassion for his confusion. This response, neither reactive nor detached, is the expression of mature relational intelligence. It acknowledges that people come with their own history, and that history often writes the scripts they follow in love. But it also understands that it is not your responsibility to rewrite someone's script. That must come from within them. You can witness it. You can understand it, but you cannot heal it for them. The physiology of early attachment is more than just emotional. It is deeply neurological. The limbic system, the brain's emotional center, develops through connection with caregivers. If those caregivers were inconsistent or emotionally absent, the brain adapts to expect instability. This affects the way a person experiences love, trust, and safety. When a man who craves you suddenly falls silent, it is often his limbic system that is reacting. It is not his rational mind. It is the imprint of his earliest relationship saying, "This is too close, you might leave. Don't trust it." What often surprises people is that these imprints are not erased by time. They remain active until they are consciously transformed. A man may have built a successful career, led teams, managed businesses, but still be terrified of intimacy, because emotional safety is not built in the mind. It is built in the body. And when the body feels threatened, no amount of logic can calm it. It requires breath, awareness, presence, and repetition. This is why some men appear strong in public but fragile in intimacy. The arena of emotional closeness activates their deepest fears. They crave love, but they have not yet created an inner environment where love feels safe. And so, they enter relationships like someone entering cold water. Hesitant, trembling, ready to run at the first shiver. If you have ever experienced a man craving you and then going silent, it may be helpful to ask not what is wrong with him, but what is still unhealed within him. And more importantly, what part of me is drawn to this dance? Sometimes, the silent man is not just triggering your confusion. He is reflecting your own unspoken pattern. Perhaps the part of you that wants to be chosen by someone emotionally unavailable is still healing from a wound that said love must be earned, not received. Relationships are not just about compatibility. They are about nervous system alignment. Two people can be wildly attracted to each other, but if one is grounded and the other is disoriented, the connection will not sustain. Not because they don't care, but because the energetic rhythms don't harmonize. This is not a failure, it is feedback. It invites both people to look within. When a man's nervous system is in disarray, he may crave a woman's stillness, but that very stillness will also confront his chaos. It will ask him to slow down, to feel, to stop hiding. For some, this is unbearable. They leave, not because they don't want love, but because they don't yet feel safe enough to receive it. And when they leave, the woman has a choice: collapse into self-doubt or rise into deeper clarity. Clarity is born when you stop interpreting emotional confusion as a puzzle to be solved and begin seeing it as a signal to honor your own path. A man's silence may be his survival mechanism, but your self-worth does not have to be part of his survival strategy. You can hold compassion without absorbing chaos. You can care without compromising your center. This is the balance that emotionally mature women begin to walk, not out of coldness, but out of wisdom. They see the wounded child behind the silent man, but they also understand that love cannot grow in a space where safety is missing, and so they do not try to fix him. They simply continue forward, soft but strong, open but boundaried, loving but clear. Some relationships are not meant to be healed together. Sometimes the silence you receive is an invitation not to chase someone else's peace, but to deepen your own. Sometimes the silence is not punishment. It is the echo of an old wound you did not cause. And when you understand this, the need to be chosen disappears, because you have already chosen yourself. There is one more truth that belongs here. A man's silence may come from pain, but your response to it can come from power. The power of self-awareness, the power of emotional discipline, the power of not needing anyone to complete what is already whole within you. And when that power becomes your foundation, silence no longer frightens you. It becomes a filter, a mirror, a guide. And so when the man craves you but goes silent, you no longer ask, "What did I do?" You ask, "What does his silence reveal about the path he's walking? And is that a path I am willing to follow with him?" You listen not to his words, but to his energy. You watch not for promises, but for patterns. And in that stillness, you return to yourself again and again until nothing and no one can take you away from the home you have built inside. There is a unique kind of power in silence when it is chosen not as a weapon or a punishment, but as a profound act of self-mastery. In the dance of relationships, especially when a man craves yet remains silent, it is tempting to fill the void with questions, with messages, with explanations. The urge to break the silence is natural. It is born from the human desire to connect, to be seen, to be valued. Yet, the woman who learns to embrace her own silence, not out of frustration, but out of mastery, begins a transformation that transcends any external circumstance. Silence from you is not absence. It is not retreat. It is a deep statement of presence. It says, "I do not need to prove my worth. I am enough." When you stop chasing explanations and stop demanding answers, you reclaim the energy that silence often consumes. You stop feeding the cycle of uncertainty. This is emotional discipline, not coldness, not detachment, but a steady, calm strength that radiates from within. Consider the story of Noor, a woman who had been in and out of relationships where men disappeared without notice. Early on, she would call, text, and ask for clarity, trying to fill the silence with her own voice. But over time, this left her exhausted and emotionally drained. One day, she decided to experiment. The next time silence came, instead of reacting, she turned inward. She sat with her breath, grounded herself in the moment, and allowed the silence to be exactly that, silence. The first few days were difficult. Her mind raced, replaying conversations, imagining worst-case scenarios. But slowly, something shifted. The silence became a mirror reflecting her own inner world. She realized that her need to fill the silence was tied to a deeper fear, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being unseen. When she faced that fear directly, without distraction or avoidance, it lost its power. This kind of silence becomes a sanctuary, a space of clarity where you can distinguish between what belongs to you and what belongs to another. When a man is silent, it often triggers a spiral of doubt. But when you choose silence for yourself, it creates a different spiral, a spiral upward into presence and peace. The body plays a vital role in this transformation. Emotional discipline is not just a mental exercise, it is a practice of the nervous system. When you stop reacting impulsively to silence, your body learns a new rhythm. The breath slows, the heart rate stabilizes, the vagus nerve activates, calming the fight, flight, freeze responses. Over time, this physiological shift rewires the way you experience absence, not as threat, but as space. There is an ancient teaching from the East that says, "In stillness, the world moves." This paradox highlights a deeper truth. Sometimes, not doing is the most powerful action. When you stop chasing, you create the conditions for what is authentic to emerge. When you release the need for control, you allow flow. In relationships, this flow often reveals what is genuine and what is habitual. The practice of silence also strengthens boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, they are invitations. They say, "This is my space. This is where I begin and end." When you hold silence with compassion and clarity, you protect your energy without pushing others away. You teach through presence rather than through words. The silence itself becomes a message, clear, respectful, and unshakable. In the story of Hannah and Omar, Hannah had experienced many cycles of pursuit and withdrawal. Omar, a man she cared deeply for, often fell into silence when things became too intimate. Initially, Hannah responded with anxiety and pursuit, trying to coax him out of his silence. But after years of this pattern, she began to experiment with her own silence. Instead of reaching out immediately, she grounded herself, asked herself what she needed, and respected her own space. To her surprise, Omar's silence did not grow into distance. Instead, he began to reflect her calm. When he did reach out, their conversations were clearer, more honest, less desperate. Hannah's silence was not punishment. It was a form of emotional leadership. She was no longer a participant in his chaos. She was a beacon of calm. This leadership requires humility and courage. It is easy to mistake silence for avoidance or coldness, but in reality, it demands showing up for yourself in the most vulnerable way. It is about trusting that your worth is not dependent on constant reassurance. It is about becoming your own home. Neuroscience supports this. Practices that cultivate emotional regulation, such as mindful breathing, meditation, and somatic awareness, enhance the prefrontal cortex's ability to modulate emotional responses. This means that with consistent practice, you become less reactive and more responsive. Silence becomes a choice, not a habit born from fear. When you embody this kind of mastery, you shift the relational dynamic entirely. Instead of being pulled into someone else's emotional turbulence, you remain grounded. You become less available to emotional chaos and more available to authentic connection. The men who are ready will move toward that groundedness. The ones who are not will reveal themselves through their inability to meet that presence. There is a profound quote that captures this essence. What you resist persists, but what you embrace transforms. When you embrace your own silence, rather than resisting it through frantic communication or over-explanation, you transform the energy around you. You stop feeding uncertainty with reaction. You reclaim your power. This transformation is not instant. It requires patience, practice, and self-compassion. The mind will resist stillness. Old fears will surface. But each time you return to your breath, each time you choose presence over reaction, you deepen your roots. In time, silence from a man who once craved you does not feel like a void. It feels like space. Space to grow, space to heal, space to discern. And your own silence becomes a sacred offering to yourself and to the truth of the relationship. In the vast landscape of human connection, words come and go, but presence remains. When you no longer chase explanations, you begin to hear the unspoken language of energy and intention. You begin to understand that the deepest communication happens not between lips, but between hearts aligned in stillness. As your silence teaches you to hold space for yourself, it also teaches others how to show up. It is not a demand, but an invitation to maturity. It calls forth those who can meet you where you are, not just craving, but ready, not just drawn, but grounded. In this sacred silence, you find a wellspring of strength that no external circumstance can shake. You become whole, you become clear. And in that clarity, you discover the profound truth. Sometimes the most powerful way to take back your power is simply to be still. When silence enters the space between two people, it is rarely empty. It carries within it unspoken fears, unresolved histories, and unseen emotional patterns. A man may crave you deeply and still fall silent, not because he lacks feeling, but because he lacks readiness. His nervous system may be overwhelmed by the very intimacy he desires, and what appears as emotional distance is often the echo of wounds that were never fully acknowledged or healed. But you are not responsible for deciphering another's silence. You are responsible for how you respond to it. When you stop reaching into the void and begin turning inward, everything changes. Your silence, rooted in self-awareness, not pain, becomes a sanctuary. It reflects strength, not punishment. It calls forth those who are prepared to meet you, not those who are only passing through your life with borrowed intentions. In understanding that emotional craving is not the same as emotional readiness, you protect your energy. In recognizing that early attachment wounds shape adult intimacy, you offer compassion without sacrificing boundaries. And in realizing the power of your own stillness, you stop begging for clarity and start living from it. You are not here to fill someone's emotional absence with your presence. You are here to honor your own depth, your own rhythm, your own wisdom. Let those who are meant to walk with you arrive not in noise, but in awareness. And if they cannot rise to meet you, may your silence continue to speak the language of quiet power, unshaken, unwavering, unmistakably whole.